All right, welcome to lecture 9. So this is lecture for the week 9, and in this lecture we're going to take a look at the chapter 4, not chapter 4, chapter 7, which is painting. So this is a relatively longer chapter compared to the chapter 6, and so I think there is a lot to cover, so let's get right in. In this chapter, we're gonna look at these 4 points. We're gonna learn how to describe the ancient technique of painting, and we're gonna learn how to identify the advantages and disadvantages of fresco, to describe the use of tempera paint throughout the history, and to discuss the unique characteristic of oil paints. So, what is painting? What comes in your mind when you think about painting and art? I mean, obviously, this is the most well-known work of art of all time, Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. So to Leonardo da Vinci, painting was something that embraces and contains within itself all things produced by nature. And for the 17th century Spanish playwright Pedro Calderón de la Barca, it was the sum of all arts, the principal art, which encompasses all the others. So still, some people argue that painting is the highest form of the medium of the art. But these days, I mean, yeah, that's very arguable. Right, so painting has been inspiring extravagant admiration in cultures. Even today, I mean, to you guys, if I were to ask you to name an artwork, 9 out of 10, they will name a painting. Probably Mona Lisa, So, but what is painting and how it's made? So paint is made of pigment mixed with medium or vehicle. So vehicle is a liquid that holds the pigment particle together with binder. So binder is what makes the pigment stick onto the surface. And without binder, pigment will just simply dry up as powder and fall off. So artist paint generally comes in paste-like consistency, and to be applied with ease with a brush, it has to be diluted. So the two categories of paints that we are most familiar with are aqueous and non-aqueous paints. So let's take a look at those. So watercolor paints are an example of an aqueous medium. So it can be diluted with water, which why it's called aqueous, and applied to the surface. So biggest disadvantage, I mean, I don't want to say the negative thing first, but I just don't like watercolor personally. But anyway, biggest disadvantage of watercolor is that it is very difficult to layer paints due to its weak binding capability and the general intensity, the density of the pigment within the paints. So if you have painted with watercolor before, you probably know what I'm talking about. And it is very difficult to do so to achieve a successful painting. So if you apply a dark paint, you cannot paint over with anything that is lighter than that to make any kind of a correction. So if you're painting with watercolor, you must be conscious about where to paint with what color, and have a clear idea and planning how you want your final work is going to look like. The next example would be oil painting, also a non-aqueous medium. So oil paints can be diluted with turpentine or mineral spirits or paint thinner. Paint thinner is pretty much based on those two chemicals. So these type of paints have stronger binding ability and have a more denser pigment within the paint. So the biggest advantage of non-aqueous mediums such as oil paint is that it can be layered much easier than watercolor, which makes it more forgiving. So, however, generally speaking, non-aqueous, especially oil paint, takes much longer time to dry, which can be both advantage and disadvantage. Next, non-aqueous painting paints that we're going to look at is acrylic. So one of the most forgiving medium of among those three. So acrylic paints are fast drying and water soluble when they are wet and waterproof when they are dry. So with it, colors can be layered easily, acting like an oil paint, but dries faster and cleans easier like watercolors. So the texture of acrylic paint tends to be a little bit lighter than oil paint, but thicker than watercolor, so it's right in the middle. So if you want to get into painting, I strongly recommend getting some experience with acrylic first, and then move on to other mediums such as oil paints and watercolors. So these are the three most common types of paint that we see. So if you go to Michaels, these are the three main type of paints that you can buy today. Next, we're going to talk about support. So all of these type of paints, they have to be painted on something, right? So the surface that paints are applied is called support, which can be canvas, paper, wood panel, wall, etc., or body sometimes. So for the maximum binding, the support is often prepared to receive paint with a ground or primer. So if you ever painted your house, professional way of doing it is preparing the surface with a primer. So that primer is designed to penetrate the surface of support and then create a maximum binding, so that when the paint is applied, it has that kind of a strong binding to the painting surface. So let's talk about a little bit more exotic mediums such as encaustic paints. So encaustic paints is wax and resin based, just like the crayons. So when the colors are heated, the wax melts and works as a vehicle, which allows pigments to be easily brushed and applied to the support. So after the painting is completed, a heat is applied close to the surface, usually with like a blowtorch, to fuse colors and create really interesting effects. So it was an important technique in ancient Greece. The oldest surviving encaustic paint is paints are funeral portraits created during the first centuries of Egypt, which was under Roman Empire's rule. So portraits such as this example right here are often set into the coffins to identify and memorialize the dead who's inside of the coffin. So encaustic paints are known for their longevity, which can be seen in this example just by looking at how fresh the colors are. Almost 2,000 years ago and still look like that. That is very impressive. So despite its effectiveness, this technique was forgotten after the fall of the Roman Empire. There are a few artists who still practice this technique. So let's take a look at this video.
I love the word alchemy to describe what I'm doing, and I feel that every day. I do feel like I'm chasing moments. There is this urgency when you're working with encaustic. You have a fleeting opportunity to manipulate the wax before it does solidify again. I have to constantly remind myself that I am wielding a blowtorch, and I need to be present and keep moving with what's happening. But oftentimes I find myself getting mesmerized by the surface of the work as it's unfolding. The feeling I get when I'm creating a work is it's not really me making this work. It's all of these natural, inherent, happy accidents that are combining to create these beautiful surfaces. The imagery emerges. I'm trying to work with what the materials want to be, and the landscapes are flowing from that. What's really been interesting to me to observe is how it connects to most people. And I think that goes back to the aspect of it mirroring nature. There's something inherently pleasing and at the same time something that it brings back knowledge. It's like some deep knowledge of the world, of nature, of how things work. And when you see this visual of it, you're just sort of reminded of that.
Beautiful. Notice how she put on a layer of wax and then she put on the pigment and then she used the blowtorch to create that really interesting texture and pattern. Alright, so next technique that we're going to look at is fresco. So fresco is a technique where pigment is applied to freshly laid or wet plaster. So water is used as the vehicle to bind pigment with that wet plaster. So if you ever mixed plaster, it requires a lot of water. So the fresco painting is using that kind of a chemical science behind the plaster to bind the pigment to the surface. So when plaster dries and hardens, the lime in plaster undergoes a chemical transformation and acts as a binder, fusing the pigment with the plaster surface. So once it completely dries, the pigments are locked in with the plaster and becomes the part of the wall. So plaster is pretty much it's a rock, so it becomes its own surface. So fresco is very important technique since it has been widely used for wall paintings, especially large-scale murals like this example, since the ancient times. So this example is Michelangelo's The Ceiling of Sistine Chapel in Vatican City. So fresco painting must be carefully planned and it requires such intense physical labor. The plaster, that is because the plaster can only be painted when it is properly wet, which that state it does not last much long. So that means that artists must plan each day's work and spread plaster only in the area that can be painted in one session. So fresco is especially difficult medium to work with because every brushstroke is a commitment and it cannot be painted over to make any kind of a correction. So only way to make correction is to let the plaster dry and chip it away with a chisel and then repeat the same process all over again. So whereas in oil paint you can just paint over it and then just call it a day, but with the fresco painting, if you make a mistake, you're gonna let it dry. It takes about like a day to dry, and then carve it with a chisel and a hammer, and then repeat the same process and then paint over it. Let's take a look at how the fresco paint works.
In the method that Botticelli would have used, we utilize the Renaissance technique of fresco, or rather the fresco technique of the Giotto period. First, a rough layer of plaster, called the arriccio, is applied to the surface of the wall with a trowel. This plaster is composed of thick sand and lime with a ratio of 1 part lime to 3 parts of inactive material, or thick sand. This layer is allowed to dry for 1 or 2 days before it is ready for the second layer. The thin, smooth second layer of plaster, called the intonaco, is then applied, and this plaster is composed of lime and a finer inactive material such as fine sand or marble dust. This last layer of plaster is the fine surface that serves as the giornata, or day's work, ready to accept the pigment. Artists during the Renaissance would have had a workshop, and therefore many apprentices would have all worked on a fresco commission together. First, the artist sketches the composition onto the animal skin glue for reference. The outlines are then poked with a needle to produce a series of holes that will allow pigment to pass through. The tracing paper with the image, or the cartoon, is then held to the surface, and a bag made with a thin material filled with pigment is patted over the surface of the tracing paper, gently forcing the pigment to pass through the holes of the image, depositing them onto the surface of the fresco. Then, using a brush, they connected the dots to produce a basic line drawing of the artist's original composition. The next step is to use a pigment called verdaccio to develop a basic monochrome tonality, creating a base for tonal harmony when other colors are applied. After the verdaccio, white is applied in the highlights, and then other colors can be introduced. The colors should remain somewhat transparent, and a correct proportion of water mixed with the pigment is imperative. The artist only has 9 to 12 hours to work with the plaster before it is completely dry, so they must work quickly. Frescoes are strong due to the chemical bond that is created when the water passes through the lime, bringing calcium to the surface. As the water evaporates, the calcium interacts with oxygen, creating a transparent, final protective layer for the work.
Alright, so that's the science behind the fresco. Alright, so next technique that we're going to be looking at is tempera painting, which was one of the most popular medium back then, before the rise of the oil paints. So tempera, also known as egg tempera, is a permanent and fast-drying painting medium which shares qualities with both watercolor and oil paint. So like watercolor, tempera is aqueous medium, and like oil paint, it dries to a rough, insoluble film. Excuse me. However, unlike how oil paint yellow and darken with age, tempera color retain their brilliance and clarity for centuries, as you can see in this example. Look at that yellow, how intense that yellow is. Tempera painting has been created with many other binders. However, the most well-known binder of tempera painting is egg yolks. So the tempera paints dry very quickly, and so colors cannot be blended easily once they are set down. So if you ever made like a fried egg, if you drip some egg yolks on top of your stove, you'll see how fast they dry, and then once they are fully dry, you'll notice how hard it is to scrape it off. So tempera painting is using that binding force to bind the pigment to the support, the surface, the painting surface. So although tempera can be diluted with water and applied in a broad wash, painters who use it most commonly build up forms gradually with fine hatching and cross-hatching strokes, just like drawing. So traditionally, tempera was often painted on a wood panel, prepared with ground up gesso, which is a mixture of white pigment and glue that sealed the wood and could be sanded to a smooth finish. Let's take a look at how tempera paint used, or the science behind the tempera painting.
Crack and separate an egg, preserving the yolk. Puncture the membrane of the yolk and drain into a container. Combine the yolk with equal parts water. The mixture should be a milky yellow. This will be used as a binder to apply the underpainting to the panel. For the reproduction, the image is transferred onto the panel. Raw umber is rubbed onto the back of the copy. Once taped down, trace over the outlines and major features of the image. When the paper is removed, a sketch of the original will remain. Brush over the outline with the egg mixture to bind it to the panel. Mix green earth pigment and water into a muddy consistency. Again, using the egg mixture, paint a wash over the warm areas of the painting. This wash will help the warm colors stand out in the final painting. Mix water and pigment to make a muddy paste, this time using raw umber and titanium dioxide, and create a value scale between the two. Dip the brush into the egg mixture and combine with the chosen value until the paint is fluid like watercolor. Weave individual brush strokes together in order to create value transition and volume, working from dark to light until the underpainting is completed. Mix shellac and a small amount of yellow ochre to make a wash. Brush the mixture over the finished underpainting in order to create warm tones. This will also protect the underpainting from the oil paint.
Alright, so that is the science behind the tempera painting. Okay, so next type of painting that we're going to look at is oil paint. So oil paints are type of slow drying paints that have pigments suspended in drying oil. Historically, most commonly used oil is linseed oil. So these days, poppy seed oil is often used for lighter pigments, which do not yellow over time as linseed oil tends to do. So what all these oils have in common is that they will dry at room temperature, leaving the pigment particles suspended in a transparent oily film. The oil paints were first introduced in Western Europe as early as 12th century and became popular in 14th and 15th century. So by the 15th century, oil paint had surpassed the popularity of tempera painting, and it had become the medium of choice in Northern Europe, especially in Flemish country. So until the introduction of acrylic paints in the 1950s, oil paint had remained as the supreme medium of painting, and it was the go-to medium for any type of, I don't say any type of, but majority type of the paintings that artists were producing. So this is an oil paint example of oil painting created by Petrus Christus. This is an oil painting, example of oil painting created by Petrus Christus, a Flemish painter in 1449. So when oil paints were first introduced, many artists who were still painting on wood panels started to adopt canvas, which offer a few advantages. So for one thing, artists were able to paint in much larger surface, which was like a style of that time, and also it was able because canvas can be stretched almost unlimited size. And second, canvas could be rolled up for easy and safe shipment to serve distant patrons, whereas the wood panels tends to be bulky and heavy and hard to transport. And unlike tempera painting, oil paint dries very slowly, which allows artists far more time to manipulate the paint. So which means artists can spend much longer time creating meticulous details and color blendings and things like that. And also it's very forgiving because you can paint it over it. So it's not like where fresco you have to like chip it away. No, with oil paint you can just paint over it or scrape it off and then paint again. So colors can be layered next to each other and blended seamlessly and softly, and they can be painted wet on wet, meaning that you can paint over the wet oil paint with different kind of paint, which is just impossible with watercolor. With watercolor, if you try to do that, everything is just gonna get mixed together, and then what you have left is just blob of brown surface. Okay, so let's take a look at the how oil paint was used throughout the history. So this is kind of a long video, so let's get started.
I think sometimes when we're talking about art history, we forget that the people who are making this are really artists. And so it's really important to have a sense of what this material feels like and why people used it. What we have up on the screen is Sensicaria altarpiece painting by Giovanni Bellini, who's known for this vivid color and very complex sort of atmospheres, glorious luminosity in his paintings. And in fact, he used oil paint in a really interesting way. Oil paint has a kind of translucency, and he really used that to advantage, but in a way that modern painters don't generally.
Can you explain what that means, translucency?
What is oil paint? Isaac, when you paint, you don't go and grind your minerals and add linseed oil to it, do you?
No, not at all, but that's what they would have done in the time of Bellini.
How does he get this kind of jewel-like color? You know, that's something that we might have expected to see in northern painting in the 15th century.
Well, it comes from northern painting. Oil paint have different consistencies depending on what varnish you use with them. If you use Damar resin with them, Damar resin is just a natural tree sap. It looks just like amber. It's like a jewel. And what you do is dissolve this into turpentine and then mix it with the oil paint in order to make these transparent glass-like. They're just panes of paint. They're almost like stained glass layers of translucent paint.
So when the light hits this, the light is not hitting just the top surface of the canvas and the paint on the canvas. It's not sort of an opaque layer. What you're saying is that the light is actually entering in, almost like a prism.
The light can enter through all of them and go to the white surface before it reflects back. So they seem to glow from the inside.
So that really is like a gem, because that's really what happens when you look at a diamond. Light is entering, it's bouncing around inside before it finally comes back out again.
So I think a lot of people have this idea of oil paint as being a kind of thick and gooey substance, but the way that you're talking about it with Renaissance artists applying thin glazes of color and many layers of them, it's a very, very different idea of oil paint application. It's not thick gooiness, but a rather thin layers of it. Is that right?
Yeah.
That makes sense to me. And so that means that when Bellini was painting this, he must have been painting, for instance, if you look at that brilliant blue of the Virgin Mary's dress, it wouldn't have been that blue on his brush. It would have been that blue very, very thinned out.
Does anyone know how many layers they applied?
Well, I've heard in the dozens.
Really?
Yeah.
The paint had to dry in between each layer completely, right?
Oil
But what
doesn't
Damar
dry.
does is Damar speeds up the drying a little bit.
So how long would it take a layer to dry normally?
Well, it depends on how much
Humidity is in the air,
and
too.
how much oil there is. I mean, there are those stories of very heavily built up canvases by Van Gogh. You have a skin that is dry, but inside there's probably still some viscosity. So this luminosity, this brilliance of color is a really important characteristic of oil paint. But there's another important characteristic of oil paint which really differentiates it from tempera before it, which is that if you're not using the Damar, that the oil will have this really sort of wonderfully liquid quality, and it allows for the paint to come off the brush in a very long stroke, and it allows for the paint to be mixed on the canvas as opposed to just on the palette. This is Turner's Rain, Steam, Speed, the Great Western Railway.
So you think Turner's actually mixing the paints on the canvas, or?
Oh, that's a tough one. I
Maybe.
don't know exactly what his technique
I
is.
think so. Yeah, and I would build on what you said about oils. This tempera is relatively flat, as is acrylic. And sort of the best tempera I think of is Botticelli's work, where it's very linear and all the colors form these flat, kind of interlaced lines.
Like hatching.
Yeah,
The artist has to
like
do
hatching. Yeah, the basic unit of the painting is line. But in oils, the basic unit is surface or atmosphere. It becomes infinitely more complex. One color can penetrate another, and just by working with two colors, you can get an infinite array of colors. My position, I guess, on Turner, knowing the rapidity of his pace, is that with this painting, he probably let the colors be alive and mix them on top of each other and allow them to penetrate each other and emerge and sink down beneath one another.
That sounds so much more as if the process of painting exists in this sort of direct confrontation of the artist and the canvas, as opposed to something that's much more premeditated, much more sort of worked out, and more completely preconceived. What I'm thinking about is, I mean, here we have a much more modernist canvas, and I'm wondering how much of a role media played in the development of modernism as an aesthetic. In this canvas, we have this, a painting that was criticized, a perfect exemplar of modernity ripping through what had been a pastoral landscape.
But so what comes first, though? There's a kind of individualist part of the kind of romantic.
All right. Alrighty, so that's how the place of oil paints in the history of painting.
Sensibility.
Alright, so that is it for today's lecture. So when we get back from the spring break, so which will be April 12th, we are going to have the second exam. So that exam is going to be open on from 12th to 16th April to 11:59 p.m. just like the last time. And this time I will give you guys a little bit more time to work on it, because looking at the last exam, the average grade was just too low. So that's why I gave you guys this 20% extra credit assignment as well. And this time you will have an hour, and then this is going to be same 30 questions. And make sure to take it, especially those who did not take the first exam for some reason. You are going to need this, and you are going to have to do really well to get a passing grade. And I will be posting the study guide sometime later this week, so you guys can use that study guide to study throughout the either this weekend or during the spring break, which I don't think no one will, or on the week of the 12th, which exam is open, because the exam will be open until the April 16th. And don't wait until the 16th to take your exam, because last time a lot of you had a technical problem and things like that. So if you email me like on the night of the Friday, which is 16th, I won't be able to help you out. So make sure to at least take it on the Thursday night or Friday morning, so that if there's unexpected things happen, you can you have a day to resolve the problem and then take the exam. Okay, and what else? Alright, so I think that is it for today, and next week we're gonna finish up the chapter 7, and if we have time we might take a look at some of the different mediums of paintings. And yeah, so I'll see you guys on the next lecture video.